My name is Tessa Morgan, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the one standing just beyond the reach of my family's affection. It wasn't always obvious at first glance from the outside. We appeared to be a perfectly ordinary family holidays, spent gathered around the dinner table, photos displayed neatly on the mantel, smiles arranged just so for friends and neighbors, but behind closed doors, in the quiet spaces where truth lives, I always felt a subtle distance, a coldness that lingered in the air whenever my parents looked at me compared to my brother. My brother, Ethan, was everything my parents ever wanted. He had charm, confidence, and an easy laugh that filled rooms and warmed hearts effortlessly. Growing up, Ethan could do no wrong. Every success was celebrated with enthusiasm. Every mistake gently excused and forgotten. Meanwhile, I stumbled along behind him, quieter, more cautious, carefully weighing each step, hoping desperately not to disappoint anyone, yet somehow, disappointment always seemed to follow me. My best was never quite good enough. My efforts, no matter how sincere, faded into insignificance next to Ethan's effortless shine. It wasn't dramatic or violent. This subtle rejection, it was something quieter, something more insidious. I felt it every time my mother's smile tightened just a fraction when I entered the room, every time my father looked at me with impatience, as though my presence was an inconvenience. At family gatherings, I learned to slip quietly into the background, avoiding attention that would inevitably turn critical. Silence became my shield, careful obedience my defense. But the deepest wound came from my grandmother's passing. Grandma Ruth had always seen something in me no one else seemed willing to recognize. She spoke to me gently, as though she understood the silent storm of insecurity swirling beneath my calm exterior. She never made me feel small or inadequate. On quiet afternoons spent sipping tea at her kitchen table, she'd whisper stories of her youth, sharing wisdom I clung to desperately in those rare moments when life felt kind. After Grandma Ruth died, I grieved quietly, painfully aware that my loss felt uniquely lonely. Ethan and my parents mourned briefly and publicly, then quickly returned to life as usual. They never noticed how deeply I'd been shaken, how alone I felt without the one person who truly saw me. But Grandma Ruth, even in her absence, left behind something significant, a final, quiet act of love. She had placed both Ethan's and my names equally on the deed to her old, beautiful heritage home, the home that now belonged to my parents. It was a silent, powerful gesture meant to remind us both of our worth, a gesture that went entirely unnoticed by my family, who assumed my presence on the paperwork was merely a formality. Life continued much as it always had, but my sense of invisibility deepened. I felt myself fading, becoming the ghost they seemed determined to make of me. Every conversation was a subtle reminder of where I stood, or rather, didn't stand. Every glance was loaded with quiet disapproval or subtle disappointment. I endured this quietly, believing that someday I might finally find acceptance, that perhaps my steady persistence might earn me a place among them. Yet as the years passed, the truth grew clearer. I wasn't just unseen, I was unwanted. My presence, my existence, was becoming increasingly inconvenient for them, a burden they carried with quiet resentment. I felt it intensely, this growing truth, but I pushed it down, afraid to acknowledge just how deep the rejection went. It would take a single moment of undeniable betrayal, one quiet yet devastating action, to finally open my eyes completely, to finally reveal the heartbreaking depth of my family's quiet rejection and set me on the path toward finding strength I never knew I possessed. I remember vividly the day everything changed, the day my quiet suspicions became a deafening reality. It was an ordinary Saturday morning, bright and deceptively cheerful. As I sat in the kitchen nursing a cup of coffee, my parents had asked me to come over, and I'd agreed without question, hoping secretly that perhaps they had finally softened toward me. Maybe they'd recognized my quiet efforts to belong. Or perhaps they'd simply missed me after weeks of silence. But when I arrived, something felt immediately different, colder somehow. The usual comforting scent of home had been replaced with an unsettling tension that hung thickly in the air. Ethan was already sitting at the kitchen table, leaning back confidently in the chair as if he owned the space. My parents stood together, near the counter, exchanging glances, quietly waiting for the right moment. When my father cleared his throat, my stomach tightened instinctively. I knew something painful was coming, though I could never have anticipated just how deeply it would cut. Tessa, my father began in a voice that was calm yet detached, as though addressing a distant acquaintance rather than his daughter. Your mother and I have been thinking about things for a while now. and we've decided it's time you started pulling your own weight somewhere else. The words hit me softly at first, gently enough to seem unreal, but the sting came swiftly, searing beneath my skin, the implication clear even beneath his careful phrasing. "What do you mean?" I asked, voice quiet and uncertain, my heart already beginning to sink beneath a wave of dread. My mother's gaze shifted nervously between Ethan and my father, refusing to meet my eyes directly. "It's just, you haven't really contributed," she murmured quietly, each word carefully measured, as if she were gently delivering news she'd rehearsed many times before. "We think it would be better if you figured out life somewhere else. Ethan needs space to grow, and honestly, there's just nothing here for you anymore." Her words felt like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs, freezing me in place. I turned to Ethan instinctively, hoping for even a flicker of sympathy, but instead, I found quiet triumph reflected back at me. He was smiling slightly, the way he did whenever he'd won something important. This moment, I realized painfully, was exactly what he'd wanted. "We're giving the house to Ethan," my father continued calmly, as though explaining a simple decision rather than altering the course of my entire life. "He has plans, ambition. You, Tessa, you're holding everyone back." Every carefully hidden insecurity, every quietly swallowed doubt surged suddenly to the surface, overwhelming me. It hurt more deeply than I ever imagined possible. Being dismissed like this, discarded as though I had never belonged in the first place, yet, despite the intensity of the betrayal, I remained silent. I didn't shout or argue or even cry. I merely stared at them, feeling a quiet numbness spread slowly through my chest, dulling the initial sharp pain into something heavy, something aching and inescapably sad. I nodded quietly, accepting their words without protest. I left the table, walked to my room, and began silently packing my things. They didn't follow me. No one asked if I was okay. No one said a word as I moved through the house, collecting fragments of my life. My entire existence there had been reduced to a few quiet boxes, stacked neatly in the back seat of my car. But as I closed the door behind me, feeling the weight of their quiet rejection fully settle into my bones, one thought offered a small, secret comfort. They'd forgotten something crucial, a detail quietly tucked away, something my grandmother had ensured would protect me, even in the midst of my quiet devastation. I held onto that fact. My name was still on the deed. My grandmother, Ruth, was the only person in that family who ever seemed to truly see me, not just as the quiet, overlooked daughter or the shadow trailing behind my brother, but as someone with worth, with dreams, with a heart that mattered. She had a way of looking past the surface, past the smiles that hid my hurt and the silence I clung to. To her, I was never a burden. I was always, simply, her granddaughter. When she passed away, it felt like losing the last lifeline I had to my family's kindness. The world suddenly seemed colder, emptier. But even in her absence, she left behind a piece of herself that neither my parents nor my brother could erase, a legal safeguard that quietly challenged their narrative of me as less than. Grandma Ruth had made sure that the house, the beautiful old heritage home that stood like a silent witness to our family's history, was legally shared between Ethan and me. Both of our names were on the deed, a fact she insisted on before she died, even when others thought it unnecessary. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. It was just a formality, a legal detail tucked away with other papers I hardly understood. I had never intended to live in that house again. Never imagined I would need to fight for my place there. But now, in the wake of their cold dismissal, that small piece of paper became my quiet weapon, a symbol of my right to belong, even if no one else believed it. It was almost ironic, really, how that old piece of paper held so much power to my family. It was probably invisible, just like me, but to me, it was a lifeline, proof that I hadn't been erased, that I wasn't as powerless as they thought. Grandma Ruth had been the only one who believed in me, and in her quiet wisdom, she had protected me in a way that even my parents couldn't undo. I tucked that deed away, holding it close to my heart as a secret reassurance. It was the one thing they hadn't taken from me. As the days passed and their silence grew louder, I clung to that knowledge, letting it strengthen the small fire that was growing inside me. I was determined not to let their words define me. Not anymore. Grandma's gift was more than just a legal document. It was a reminder that family isn't always about loud declarations or public approval. Sometimes it's in the quiet acts of love and protection, in the belief that even when you feel forgotten, you still matter. And that belief was going to carry me through the hardest fight of my life, for months after I left. The silence from my family was deafening. Every call I made was ignored. Every message left unanswered. It felt as though I'd vanished completely, as if I was no longer part of their lives, or the home I'd once shared. They didn't just shut the door on me emotionally, they literally locked me out. The locks on the front door changed without any warning, sealing me away from a place I had every legal right to enter. I remember standing on the porch one afternoon, my hand resting hesitantly on the cold brass doorknob, hoping they might have had a change of heart, but there was nothing, no creak of the door, no familiar footsteps inside. Just silence. It hit me then, the depth of their determination to erase me, to pretend I had never existed in that house. That family. It wasn't long before Ethan, emboldened by their silence, threw a party there, a celebration of my absence. I heard through mutual friends about the night he bragged that he'd finally gotten rid of me, that the house was his alone now. The thought of him, laughing with his friends, in the space that was also mine, ignited a mix of anger and sorrow inside me. But even then, I kept my anger buried beneath layers of quiet resilience. I refused to stoop to shouting matches or public scenes. Instead, I focused on the quiet work of reclaiming what was mine. I reached out to a lawyer, someone who helped me understand the weight of the deed in my name and the rights that came with it. I connected with a real estate investor, an old mentor who had always believed in me when no one else did. Together, we began to quietly explore options, plans that would force my family to recognize me not with words or protests, but with legal certainty. The more I learned, the more determined I became. I wasn't going to be the powerless daughter they dismissed or the forgotten sister they locked out. They might have tried to erase me from their lives, but they hadn't erased my rights, and soon they would have no choice but to face that truth. In the silence of their neglect, I found my strength. They kicked me out like I didn't belong, but I was coming back quietly, calmly, with the power to take back what was rightfully mine. And when that day came, I wouldn't need to say a word. The papers would speak for me. The days and weeks after being locked out were some of the most isolating I've ever experienced. But they were also the days I quietly began to rebuild myself. While my family reveled in their newfound control, I was quietly making plans that would change everything. I wasn't interested in drama or loud confrontations. I wanted something far more powerful, a chance to stand tall on my own terms, to reclaim my place without begging or fighting for scraps. I reached out to my mentor, someone who had believed in me long before my family ever did. She listened carefully, not with pity, but with respect and understanding. She reminded me that strength doesn't always roar, it can be the quiet voice at the end of the day that says, "I will try again tomorrow." Together we began to explore what I could do with the house, the deed, and the legal rights my grandmother had secured for me. Hiring a lawyer was a turning point. For the first time, I had someone who spoke the language of the law, who saw the power in that document my family had ignored. My lawyer helped me understand the full weight of my ownership and the options available to me. Selling the house was one possibility, a way to force my family to recognize me. Even if they refused to do so emotionally, the idea wasn't born out of spite but out of a deep need for justice, a desire to reclaim something that had been taken from me. Every meeting, every phone call, felt like a small victory. I wasn't just a powerless girl anymore. I was a woman making decisions, setting plans, taking control. There was a quiet thrill in that, a growing confidence that came not from others' approval but from knowing I was standing up for myself. While my family continued to live as if I'd vanished, I was quietly preparing for the moment when the truth would become undeniable. It wasn't going to be loud or dramatic. It would be calm, deliberate, and just as firm as the love my grandmother had shown me in protecting my rights. And in that quiet planning, I found the courage to believe that I deserved better, that I was worth fighting for. Even if the fight was different than I'd ever imagined. When my mentor told me she had found someone interested in buying the house, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. The idea that the place my family thought they owned outright could soon belong to someone else was surreal, but more than that, it was empowering. This wasn't just a real estate transaction, it was a reclamation of my dignity, a quiet yet unmistakable declaration that I was not invisible and that I still held power in a family that had tried to erase me. The buyer was someone I respected deeply, an old mentor and friend who had watched me struggle and grow over the years. He believed in me before my family stopped doing so, and his faith became a quiet anchor. He saw beyond my quiet demeanor, beyond the label my parents had placed on me as a burden. When I shared the story behind the house and the deed, he didn't hesitate to support me. Together, we began the legal process, signing papers and filling out documents that would change everything. It was daunting, a whirlwind of terminology and procedures, but I leaned on my mentor and lawyer for guidance. Every step brought me closer to a new reality, one where I wasn't just the forgotten daughter, but a woman who had taken control of her own destiny. There were moments when doubt crept in, quiet and persistent, whispering fears of failure or regret, but I pushed through, reminding myself that this was about more than just property. It was about standing up to a family that had dismissed me, about showing myself that I was worthy of respect and recognition. As the sale moved toward completion, I felt a quiet strength growing inside me. This house, filled with so many memories both painful and precious, was no longer a symbol of rejection. It was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even when the people you love fail you, you can still find ways to protect yourself and reclaim your life. And when the day came to tell my family, I would do so not with anger or tears, but with the calm confidence of someone who knew her worth. The house was no longer theirs alone. It was mine too, and I was finally ready to make them see that. The day I signed the final papers was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. I remember sitting at the lawyer's desk, the weight of the documents pressing down on me in a way that was both terrifying and liberating. Each signature I placed on those pages felt like a step away from the daughter who had been pushed aside and toward the woman who was finally reclaiming her voice. I could feel the quiet tension in the room, a mixture of anticipation and relief. My mentor sat beside me, offering steady support, while the lawyer explained the last few details with clinical precision. I nodded along, absorbing the information but mostly focusing on what this moment meant to me: justice, closure, and new beginnings. The house, the place where I had once felt so invisible, was now mine in a way that couldn't be undone. For years, it had been a source of pain, a reminder of my family's rejection. But with this final act, it became something different, a symbol of strength, proof that I was not powerless. Signing my name felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had long been denied. It was as if every word, every initial, was quietly shouting that I mattered. I wasn't just the forgotten daughter anymore. I was someone who had stood her ground, who had fought in the quiet, steady way I knew best. There was no need for dramatic confrontations or shouting matches. The law, the paperwork, and the unshakable truth in those signatures would speak louder than any argument. I left the office that day with a calm resolve settling over me. The next time I stood in that house, it wouldn't be as an outsider, it would be as someone who had finally claimed her place. The hardest part wasn't signing the papers, it was knowing what would come next. But I was ready. I was ready to face whatever reactions my family had, to meet their anger or disbelief with quiet confidence, because this was more than just a house. This was my dignity, and no one could take that away from me. I still remember the morning I returned to the house. It was a Saturday. The kind of quiet morning where the world seems paused, holding its breath. I wasn't alone. I brought my mentor, my lawyer, and a stack of documents that felt heavier than any suitcase I'd ever carried. In my hand was the proof of years of silent endurance and quiet strength, and beneath my calm exterior, my heart pounded fiercely. When the door swung open, Ethan's familiar smug grin was the first thing I saw. He looked me up and down like I was a stranger, someone unworthy of the place he now claimed as his own. For a moment, I thought he would brush me off like always, dismiss me as insignificant as he'd done so many times before. But then, my lawyer stepped forward and handed him the papers. His eyes flicked over the legal language, confusion twisting his features as realization sank in. I watched his smug smile falter, his confidence crack, as the undeniable truth settled around us like a silent storm. Behind him, my parents appeared, their faces a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. The house was no longer theirs by choice, it had been sold, legally and irrevocably. The sale was final, and they had 30 days to leave. I stood there, steady and silent, letting the moment unfold without a word. The weight of years of being overlooked and dismissed hung in the air. But I didn't need to shout or argue. The paperwork spoke for me. It was louder than any insult or denial they could throw my way. For the first time, I wasn't the girl being pushed out. I was the one holding the power, the quiet force that had finally taken back what was rightfully mine. Ethan looked at me then, a mixture of anger and disbelief. But I met his gaze without fear or hesitation. In that moment, I realized something profound. Sometimes, the loudest voice isn't the one that shouts, but the one that simply stands firm in truth. And I was standing, finally, in mine. In the days that followed the knock on the door, the house was filled with a tense silence that none of us dared break. My family's reactions came in waves, whispers behind closed doors, hushed arguments that echoed through the walls, and bitter confrontations that I wasn't a part of. Yet I stayed removed, watching from a distance, letting the weight of the legal truth settle into their lives. I didn't gloat, didn't call or confront. I simply waited, quietly confident. 30 days might have seemed like a short time to them, but to me, it was a victory measured in patience and perseverance. Every passing day was a reminder that my presence mattered, that I had reclaimed a place I had been told I didn't deserve. It was their turn to pack boxes, to face the reality they had imposed on me for so long. Their anger was palpable when they did speak to me, accusations about betrayal, about greed, about tearing the family apart. But beneath the noise, I heard something else: fear of losing control, fear of facing their own failures, fear of a daughter who had refused to be silenced. In those 30 days, I learned the power of silence. I discovered that sometimes strength isn't in the fight, but in standing steady and allowing the truth to do its work. I spent the time preparing myself for what came next, not just the practicalities of change, but the emotional weight of breaking free. And when the final day arrived, and the keys were handed over, I felt a quiet sense of peace wash over me. This house, once a symbol of exclusion, had become a testament to resilience. It was no longer just a building, it was the place where I had reclaimed my voice, my dignity, and my power. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. I had already won. After the final day passed and my family left, I stood alone in the house for the first time in years. The silence was different now, not heavy and oppressive, but calm and full of possibility. Walking through the empty rooms, I felt a strange mix of emotions: sadness for the years lost, but also hope for the future I was finally free to create. This house, once a symbol of rejection and exclusion, had become mine, not just legally, but in a deeper, quieter way. It was a space where I could begin to heal, where I could rebuild a sense of self that had been buried under years of doubt and dismissal. Every creak of the floorboards, every ray of sunlight streaming through the windows, felt like a reminder that I belonged here. I belonged to this place, and more importantly, I belonged to myself. I thought about my grandmother, how she had protected me even when no one else would. Her faith in me was now woven into the very walls around me, a legacy of quiet strength that I was determined to honor. For the first time, I wasn't just the forgotten daughter or the shadow behind my brother. I was a woman who had found her voice, who had stood her ground, and who had taken back what was hers with dignity and grace. There was still work to do, both on the house and within myself. But for the first time, the future felt open, unburdened by the past. I could decorate these rooms, fill them with laughter and light, and make this place truly my own. I had been kicked out once, told I had nothing to offer, but I had returned not with anger or vengeance, but with quiet power and unwavering resolve. And in doing so, I finally found my place in the world, not because anyone else gave it to me, but because I claimed it for myself.